My privilege to be here with a senator with a spectacular rating on our congressional scorecard. We've been doing scorecards for 50 plus years. Senator Mike Braun is an A lifetime rating on the ACU scorecard. We are pleased that he decided to run for office to be in the U.S. Senate. Senator, why did you run for office?
So I started my own business back in the early 80s. Lucky enough, 3 of my 4 kids now are in it. When I saw what happened in 2016, when Trump came onto the scene, I was convinced half the country, if not more, fed up with business as usual in D.C. And I could have done something else, but I was a state legislator for just 3 years and said rather than go back home, big believer in term limits at the federal level, I was going to give it my whirl. And I've got the benefit of not having to calculate how I vote based upon being there forever. And if we just had that in general, I think we'd get the cream of the crop there from this country that aren't wanting to be there, get the big pension, and stay there and fall over in the halls of Congress.
Well, that gives you the platform then to address health care. We've had Obamacare weighing over our heads. This is a panel to discuss whether socialized medicine works or not. Senator, does it work?
There's no way it works. When you ask government to do more of anything, it'd be different if they were knocking it out of the park. But ever since the Great Society days, we know what that's like. At least there was a little willingness to pay for things along the way. But when we came upon the issue of health care, I took it on 15 years ago in my own business. And the healthcare industry is not competitive. It's not transparent. Barriers to entry, and you don't have an engaged consumer. I took those observations, completely changed healthcare for my own employees to get them engaged in their own well-being, number one, to avoid the broken healthcare system, put skin in the game so you shop as a healthcare consumer. It'd take more than our panel time today, but cut costs by over 50% 15 years ago, and they've only gone up 2% a year since then. But you got to think out of the box, relating it to what happens when you don't. The other side of the aisle, political enterprisers, hate to even use the word entrepreneurs, but it's on display in the Biden administration. If we, as conservatives, aren't more than the party of no or I'm not interested, when Obamacare came along, we didn't have anything. We should have had a solution to it along the lines of what I talked about.
So, in your private business, you found market incentives to try to drive down the price of health care for your employees. Nancy Pelosi, and I hope you're all listening to this, Nancy Pelosi has a couple different bills in Congress. She's trying to help you all. She's trying to make sure your prescription drugs are cheaper. That sounds like a noble goal, but how's she doing it? Barbara, you are actually from one of the strongest think tanks in the world, maybe the #1 think tank in Europe. There are lots of price controls in Europe. Does that work?
Well, price controls have never worked. They just bring socialism to everybody. And we have to, and I would follow up on what you have said, just what the senator has pointed out, the moral high grounds of the markets. We as conservatives believe in those values. And I think we should also put that into practice with medicine and Medicare, because after all, why should the markets not work for the pharmacy industry, for the medical industry? I think this is something that we really should put on the ground and lay it out. And if we look at the European example, which is a totally negative one, we have socialized medicine there, and we've had it forever. Look at our sovereign, our national budgets. 2/3 of what we spend go into this direction. So there is not much left for anything else. And this is a very negative example. So be careful what you wish for. Don't fall into the trap and make this negative examples that we see in Europe, import them, rather fight them, and don't bring the socialism into your country.
Tim, I'm going to get to you in just a second, but I want to go back to the senator who has been a successful businessman, a successful politician, Price controls, I mean, don't we all want to pay cheaper for our drugs and our health care? I mean, it's a very tantalizing thing. If all of you sitting out in the audience today, I'm sure you'd rather pay less for the drugs you take. Why can't we just have government drive down the prices with ceilings and just say you can't charge more than that?
Because you're replacing the real economy with the federal government. And that's been on display with what they've tried to do through COVID. But on the other hand, we as conservatives can't say that healthcare currently is transparent, is competitive. So we need to do, the Trump administration had about 4 executive orders out there, from transparency to addressing these issues. You know who went after him? The healthcare lobby. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, should have been called the Unaffordable Care Act, and it was big insurance in cahoots with big business. So we can't defend a broken industry, and we need to set the stage to where they can compete, to where there is transparency, and the consumer has to drive it. Because when I changed that in my own system, they started picking up the phone, going onto the web, saving 30 to 70% every time they engage it, even when the industry was making it difficult to do. That's what we need to do, or else Bernie Sanders runs the system someday.
Right. Barbara.
Let me just briefly add from the European example again. If we have those price controls, you have one-size-fits-all politics, and this has never worked, and it will never work, because after all, we are individuals, we have individual demands and needs, and we know better what is good for us than the big government up there or somebody else up there. So we have to be very careful. We saw that with the price controls, that all of a sudden medication was unavailable for poorer countries in Europe because people could not afford it anymore. And this doesn't have anything to do with the so-called justice that everybody is promoting. So very careful. If we do that, you really outmaneuver the poorer ones. And that's a bad sign.
Yeah, I started this discussion talking about price controls. That's at the very end of this supply chain.
Yeah.
The beginning of it would be the invention side, creating these things, intellectual property. I know, Tim, you're a leading authority in Washington on intellectual property rights. Barbara, you cover these issues too. The European model, the American model. Let me maybe just say one thing. Today, Russia invaded Ukraine. That's not the beginning of the war. Putin and Xi in China, they've been stealing our intellectual property and attacking our country through cyber attacks for years and years. The theft of our intellectual property is an act of war, and it's been going on a long time. Why is it so dangerous?
Intellectual property, to quote Abraham Lincoln, it adds the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. What that means is it protects people's property rights and things that they invent, but it also incentivizes people to invent. Let me give you a quick number. The United States accounts for about 4% of the world's population. We're the largest economy in the world, but that's about a quarter of the world's economy. But we account every year for about 2/3 to 70% of all new drugs introduced into the world. Why is that? That's not coincidence, it's disproportionate. It's because we protect intellectual property like no other nation in human history. It's in the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, even before the Bill of Rights.
In fact, Tim, you've just, look, I know that sometimes this gets a little wonky. I want everybody to hear this. Tim just touched on it. When we talk about constitutional rights, we're actually talking about rights found in the amendments, or sometimes judge-created law. But there's only one right actually in the Constitution, the proper portion of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the right of authors and inventors to the exclusive use of their ideas. Our founders understood that if we create a property interest in your ideas, that only not helps the economy, as Abraham Lincoln said. It also provides dignity. If you cannot keep what you invent, what you create with your mind and with your hands, if you can't keep that, that diminishes you as a human being. Intellectual property rights are critical to who we are as a people and as a person. Sorry for being on my soapbox. I get passionate about these ideas.
You should be.
You
If-
have to be. You
Yeah.
have to be. It's a basic principle because if we are not allowed to protect our property, whether it's the physical property or the intellectual property, we will not go anywhere. Innovation processes are only possible because we protect property. We protect those guys who invent and who create. And if we don't do that, we are losing out. There will not be a capitalist society without an innovation society.
And a multitude of organizations rank nations across the world in terms of how they protect intellectual property. Year after year, survey after survey, the United States is always #1 because we protect it in the Constitution, but that's why we invent 2/3 of all new drugs in the world. It's a direct correlation. We protect intellectual property and it creates that innovation. And it's not just drugs. I mean, obviously the internet, flight, the telephone, the light bulb, these are things that were based a lot of times on copyright, patent, intellectual property. So there's a direct correlation there.
Yeah.
And Dan, one thing to add to that, of the healthcare legs, insurance, hospitals, pharma, practitioners, the one part that works halfway would be discovering the therapies and the medicines. And then we destroy it with things like pharmacy benefit managers, where you create a middleman that sucks out between 180 and 300 billion. And that's where the lack of transparency. We do a great job of making the pill and then screw it all up with how we distribute it. I'm in the logistics and distribution business, and you are competing with a lot of different places that do the same thing. And then sometimes they get to where they might impede generics or tweak patents, and you got to be careful. But the one part that we do the best is coming up with it, because even back when the founders put it together, they recognized that was important.
Yeah, Barbara, you're from Europe, obviously. Germany used to invent lots of stuff, Bayer.
Yes.
They don't invent anything anymore. Why is that?
Unfortunately, because those rights are neither protected, nor do we have the right incentives for capital formation, nor the right tax structure. And these are all important incentives for enterprises and for scientists to be in a certain place to allow new ideas to become creative. And you know, if you look at the number of patents that have been protected and registered out of Austria, Germany in the past decades, this was next, in contrast to the US, 0, nothing. We're some minor. This is really very bad.
Yeah.
And this is when politics is wrong. And we've seen that with the socialism all across Europe. When one size fits all works, when you do not protect either individual property nor entrepreneurial property and intellectual property, you're outmaneuvered. And don't tax it too high. And this is what is done as well.
Yeah. Well, I know Nancy Pelosi in the House and Chuck Schumer in the Senate are really pushing these price control bills. Senator, you have a crystal ball. Can you let us know what you think the chances of those things passing?
Well, thank goodness something like that, I think, would take 60 votes to get through in the Senate, even though they try to wedge a lot of that kind of stuff into legislation called, where you're doing it just on budget stuff. So I don't think we're going to go there, but I do believe that it's up to us as conservatives. When you've got key issues like the high cost of health care, it's the thing I wrestled with the most as a small business and as it grew, that we got to come up with proposals to fix those things. And that's going to be taking on some of the powers to be. And a lot of this is coalesced between big government and big lobbyists. The biggest lobbies in DC would be pharma, insurance, hospitals. And then you'd think the US Chamber would be for making it more transparent and competitive. Well, they're with them, not with the rest of us business owners that want just the chance to compete with no leg up from government. And sadly, the biggest business in our country is healthcare, almost double what it costs the rest of the world for similar results. So there's a lot of improvement. That's where we win as conservatives, not being the party I know, or I'm not interested with good ideas.
Yeah. Well, Tim, the senator gave us a prognostication on the health side, just more broadly on the IP side. What's your temperature of DC now and the left trying to attack intellectual property rights? That was a big push for them a few years ago. Are they still trying to do that?
Yeah, they are. With the vaccines, you saw the Biden administration say that they were going to disrupt the patent rights of the groups that invented those vaccines. But the public opposes that. The Center for Individual Freedom did a study where the public, by about a 3-to-1 margin, opposes the Biden administration just forfeiting those patent rights. And so you do see some danger from existing DC establishment politicians, and the people don't like it, and it's harmful.
I mean, frankly, when the Biden administration talks about, what was the technical term you used? The Biden administration was going to...
Well, they're just going to forcibly forfeit the rights of the patent rights of the groups that invented the vaccines to get it across the world.
That sounds like theft of property to me.
It is.
Sounds like government is taking stuff.
And they had guaranteed those same rights when they incentivized those groups to invent those vaccines. And so they pulled the rug out from under them. So it's very unpopular, and that's not the way to get new drugs out into the world. So, really quickly, too, in terms of price controls, if you just look at some of the numbers, for about 200 drugs that were invented between about 2011 and 2019, almost all of them were available in America. In Europe, approximately 50% of them were available. So price controls don't lower the costs. In many cases, they mean you don't get those drugs at all. Just look at those numbers.
You know, you can look at Castro's Cuba.
Yeah.
He could impose price controls on bread.
Right.
All that meant is there were long lines for bread, and you couldn't get bread. Some of these principles are so simple.
If you prohibit tax competition, you end up with very high tax rates everywhere,
Right.
and not lower. And it's the same thing.
Well,
Simple.
Do we have, I'd like to give each of you a couple minutes, any closing thoughts that you may have. We'll end with the senator. Okay. But Tim.
Closing thoughts are, if you look at intellectual property, it protects fairness. These are property rights, just like every other sort of property rights, but it also creates real-world incentives and results where we get those inventions. Americans create those things, whether it's pharmaceuticals or other types of inventions and artistic creations. The proof is there in the real world, and so we've got to protect that, and it's also fairness.
Barbara.
I would argue that we should allow the individual to be self-responsible and to choose and pick from the choices the market provides, and allow the moral high ground of the markets to work.
All right, it's the right thing as human beings. It's the right thing for our pocketbooks.
We have to do it.
Yeah.
And fight for it.
Yeah.
And never give up.
Senator.
And as we're talking about health care, when I decided to run for Senate, it was with that frustration that on Main Street, Southern Indiana, Jasper, where I'm from, when I at least had the wisdom to move back there. My wife's had a business in our downtown for 40-some years. You know, I built the business there. It's different from how the economy works in the corporate world. So normally, that tier is teamed up with big government. And a lot of the dysfunction that we're talking about, price controls, would be due to markets not working when you concentrate power. That's happened in tech, it's happened in agriculture, it's happened in healthcare. Most of us have to live in the embrace of competition, transparency, and giving it your all, and do not have lobbyists on your staff to boot. That's what the founders set up years ago, and what always amazed me about them is when Washington and Jefferson were done, they hurried back to Mount Vernon and Monticello because they actually liked what they were doing better before, even in those heady times. A lot of it just takes getting back to what the country was built on, and you can never get where power is concentrated in an unresponsive government like I sense now we're dealing with here. Europe, it's been that way for a while. And especially when business and big corporations throw in to that same mix, it's called the swamp.
Senator, you're a champion for freedom. Thank you so much. Barbara, Tim, on your respective continents, you're doing wonderful work. Thank you all very much.